the guys in the fraternity house well. One of the things that always struck me as funny, he was actually a very talented athlete. He was also a very good singer. He sang in our wedding. But he could have played small college basketball if he'd wanted to, chose not to, so he was the star in our fraternity team. Doesn't take much to be the star in a fraternity team. So we'd often play out basketball in our outside court near the house. And one of the things that struck me early on was whenever he missed a shot, he would yell Buddha. It was like, huh. It's like, other guys would yell other things. But he would always yell Buddha. And finally I asked him, why do you keep saying Buddha when you miss a shot or throw a bad pass or whatever? He goes, well, Gary, it doesn't matter if I take Buddha's name in vain. It's like, that made sense to me. And a little bit of mix of Christian and fraternity logic kind of going there. But in his mind, while other fraternity brothers were taking the Lord's name in vain, he goes, that's not right, but hey, you can take Buddha's name in vain and no big deal. So, again, he was kind of trying to model something different. His sacrificial love came out in that he was the first guy to always go pick up a guy who got arrested from our house, probably usually a DUI, or he would be the first, if a car broke down or a guy couldn't drive and understood that because he was too intoxicated, he would go get him. Or sometimes, guys passed out in the house, he took the date home. He was the one that served everybody in a variety of ways. When we had work days around fraternity, he was always the first one to show up. And he was an interesting guy too, and he had his real estate license while he was in college, so he bought and sold houses while we were in school. And so he knew a lot of things too. He was pretty handy, and so he could fix a lot of things around the fraternity house. And he was always, again, the first one there that would do that. And so there was this interesting mix, again, of growing righteousness on display in a very healthy way. He didn't condemn the guys for their immoral behavior. He simply put something different alongside of it and lived it out. And then the sacrificial love. That it didn't matter what was required, he would step in and show those guys a very unusual love. So I mentioned he sang in our wedding. One of the challenging things for me in particular is that when he reached his 40s and he was working in Birmingham, one day he began to notice some unusual symptoms physically, and eventually they diagnosed him with ALS. And he passed away. And you guys have probably been around other people that have been diagnosed with that horrible disease, but it's a very difficult thing to watch somebody decline because of Lou Gehrig's disease. And so it was a tough moment, and yet at his funeral there were hundreds of people that were giving testimony to him about his impact on their life. Again, that was both word and deed. And I think very much what John was describing here was lived out through Ken, and it certainly impacted my life. It gave me a living picture of what the Christian life was supposed to look like lived out. Not just something that was believed, but something that was lived daily. And it was probably really the first picture of a peer that I ever had that I could walk alongside. And he helped me along the way many, many times. We actually were in the same discipleship group for 4 years while we were in college. But let's go back to the passage. If that's an example, let's get back to what John's talking about here. And don't forget that in the backdrop of this, it's going to be critical to understanding what John's going to say about sin, because this is where there's some tough understanding here about not sinning and not practicing sin that we have to understand. And in the background is still this false teaching of the Gnostics. And so we'll hit that in a minute so we can kind of make sense of this idea that we're not aiming for moral perfection in this life, but we are aiming for and trusting the Lord to produce a growing righteousness or a moral righteousness within us. So I'm going to divide this into two sections. We'll look at 2:28 through 3:10, where I think John lays out the moral test of a true follower of Christ. And then we'll pick up again in 11 through 24, where I think he lays out the social test. And so again, one is this growing righteousness, the other one is this sacrificial love. But picking up in 2:28, it says, "And now, little children, abide in him, so that when he appears, we may have confidence and not shrink from him in shame at his coming. If you know that he is righteous, you may be sure that everyone who practices righteousness has been born of him. See what kind of love the Father has given to us, that we should be called children of God, and so we are. The reason why the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is. And everyone who thus hopes in him purifies himself as he is pure." Everyone who makes a practice of sinning also practices lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. You know that he appeared to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. No one who abides in him keeps on sinning. No one who keeps on sinning has either seen him or known him. Little children, let no one deceive you. Whoever practices righteousness is righteous as he is righteous. Whoever makes a practice of sinning is of the devil, for the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. No one born of God makes a practice of sinning, for God's seed abides in him, and he cannot keep on sinning because he has been born of God. By this it is evident who are the children of God and who are the children of the devil. Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor is the one who does not love his brother. And even in that last phrase, he begins to mark the contrast and the bridge between one marker of a true follower of Christ and the next one. One of the things I want you to notice, and it's a good Bible study method tool, and that's to pay attention to the repeated words and phrases. And there's a bunch in here, if you noticed. I wrote down just a few. Born of God shows up several times in this whole passage. Little children or children, and it's a very affectionate term. And we'll talk in a little bit about where I think John picked that up from. Certainly this idea of abide or abide in him is a repeated idea and phrase. And you begin to realize that abiding somehow is the key connection to being able to grow in righteousness and demonstrate this sacrificial love. And then sinning, lawlessness, those things are kind of equated but often repeated. And then this word practice, about practicing sin or practicing righteousness, and then certainly love. So several things that I think we have to take note of here. I'll probably disagree with Stott just a bit, which is really risky. Not Stott, I said Stott, I meant MacArthur, just a little bit. He kind of makes the driving theme here in verse 28, Jesus' second coming. And while I do think that's our hope, that one of the things that anchors us and pulls us towards Jesus is the reality that he's going to come again. But I also want to make a case, because of the repeated words, that I think a lot of it has to revolve around the love of God too. So in verse 28, he highlights that he's going to return, but in chapter 3, verse 1, see what kind of love the Father has given to us. And so I think what actually is going on here is John's both kind of giving us a now motivation and a future motivation. The future motivation is his return, Jesus' return. And that is a hope, a certain hope that should pull us forward and I think drive our desire to grow in him and be pleasing to him. But in the now time also that we are existing in this perfect love relationship, because God's love is perfect, even though our love towards others is often imperfect. His love is perfect. His love is complete. It was his love that caused him to chase hard after us, to be our Redeemer, to save us. And so I think there's a couple of motivations here, that both that future hope and reality that we can anchor ourselves in, but also this love in which we exist right now that brought us to where we were. And one of the things you'll notice what John does back and forth, he actually moves back and forth between Christ's first appearance and his second appearance. Do you notice that? There's things that are happening because Jesus came and we saw him and experienced him, and obviously that he went to the cross for our sins, but then also his second coming. And so John kind of goes back and forth between these two motivations. But in this idea that the first marker is really this idea of growing righteousness, again, some things that I think we have to understand. He uses this word practice. And it too is a term of abiding. It's a unique word in the Greek language. So he's used this idea of abiding. We know that means to remain, stay stuck to, connected to. And so certainly he's saying, hey, the way this works is by staying glued to Jesus and your experiential reality as you walk with him moment by moment, day by day. Abiding in him also has this idea of dwelling in him. It's where we actually get our word abode. You may have noticed that in MacArthur's writing. And so it's dwelling there. It's staying connected to him, staying glued to him. It does have the imagery of John 15 of the branch to the vine. Staying connected into him in a vital way, that's where we actually draw our life. But this idea of practice is also the idea of execution. that out of that abiding, there's choices we make and there's an execution that comes of how we actually live moment by moment throughout the day. And so he's saying you have a choice, and there's this practice of righteousness or there's this practice of sin and lawlessness. And this is where we have to understand, because it can get a little confusing when he begins to talk about, it almost sounds like, hey, if you're a follower of Jesus, you'll never sin. We could be confused a little bit when we read this passage and fall into that trap. It was really interesting. When I used to be on full-time staff with Cru, formerly Campus Crusade for Christ, my first assignment was the University of Tennessee, and I was only 23 when I showed up there. But one of the things that struck me as soon as I got there was a brand new ministry on campus that was homegrown there in East Tennessee, and the leader was maybe in his mid-20s, but what he proclaimed strongly was you could become sinless. That if you walked with Jesus long enough, you would no longer sin. And it was very appealing. Hundreds of students went to these meetings every week. And we had numerous conversations because we sometimes bump into the same students, and we're trying to bring corrections like, that the scripture doesn't actually teach that you'll never sin again, at least not this side of heaven. And we knew that this self-righteousness, this preaching of moral perfection was only going to lead to a trap, because it was going to become will-based. And what happens when you finally do sin? What are you going to do now? And so it just led to this, not a love relationship with Christ, with this future hope of his return. It had to turn into something that was much more of this moral perfection relationship with him. And he's going to clobber you when you're wrong, and he's going to pat you on the back when you're right. And eventually, not surprisingly, it only took about 2 years, that ministry completely collapsed because it couldn't stand. Eventually, the truth and the reality of our lives points out that, okay, I'm never going to be morally perfect this side of heaven. So what is John saying when he talks about they won't sin? Well, remember, the Gnostics had two problems with sin that they were teaching. One is that you could reach moral perfection. They also believed this, that there was some way, some enlightenment reality that you could reach moral perfection. Or the other side of Gnosticism was, well, we're really separated from spirit and body, and so sin doesn't actually matter. I can do anything I want in my body, and my spirit will remain pure. So remember, Glenn's highlighted for us, those were the two teachings of Gnosticism. And that stuff still floats around again today, just like I saw it in Knoxville, Tennessee. And so we have to be careful, too, to not fall into that trap, that what John's actually saying, and this gets into the grammar of the Greek here, is that when he says you won't sin, he says what he's really saying is you won't live in a habitual state of sin. You won't sin and just stay stuck in that sin pattern, that actually your growth will show a habitual state of ever-increasing righteousness. Not that you'll reach moral perfection somehow this side of heaven, but that your life will look more and more like Jesus over time as we abide in him and stay glued to him. This is exactly what Brad preached about this past Sunday when he talked about sanctification, if you were there. And so this is it. John's saying, that's what he's saying. Practice righteousness versus practicing lawlessness. And that idea of practicing is executing what we know to be true, staying glued to Jesus day by day. And we will grow in righteousness. Our lives should look different a year from now than they do today. People should experience us a little bit different. Not perfect, but growing. Does that make sense? And I think that's what John's really trying to say when he says a marker is that growing sense of righteousness. It's challenging both to us and to the world to see somebody that professes Christ and is morally decadent. Those things can't go hand in hand. And that's where the Gnostics, especially in that second form of, hey, it doesn't matter, my spirit's pure, so I can do whatever I want, my body, makes zero sense. It should make zero sense to us, and it certainly makes zero sense to the world. Why should I believe anything you have to say when your life looks no different than mine? But if there is a growing righteousness, and a second we'll see also matched by sacrificial love, then there's every reason to pay attention, because that's different. That's counter the world. The world is constantly practicing lawlessness and sinfulness. And thus why John says that's why the world doesn't really know you. When it says know, it just means they don't understand you. They don't get it. Why don't you do what the world says you should do? But instead, we are called to stand against that in both a growing righteousness way and a sacrificially loving way. So it's, again, not self-righteousness and condemning the world. That's not our role. But he's called us to love those around us who he's placed in our orbit and to live out a growing sense of righteousness. So that's the moral test. And I'm not going to get too much into all the details because I want you guys to discuss it around the table then. But let's briefly look at the social test. So let's pick back up where we left off. And now we go to verse 11. For this is the message that you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We should not be like Cain. So we have this biblical example. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. Do not be surprised, brothers, that the world hates you. We know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brothers. Whoever does not love abides in death. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has the world's good and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. By this we shall know that we are of truth and reassure our heart before him. For whenever our heart condemns us, God is greater than our heart, and he knows everything. Beloved, if our heart does not condemn us, we have confidence before God, and whatever we ask, we receive from him, because we keep his commandments and do what pleases him. And this is his commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as he has commanded us. Whoever keeps his commandments abides in him, and he in them. And by this we know that he abides in us, by the Spirit whom he has given us. Okay, hold your spot there and go back over to the Gospel of John just for a minute. Go to John chapter 13. So I want you to see where John picks up some of this language, but also just to show you the power of mentorship, to show you the power of discipleship. Now, he had a great discipler, Jesus himself. But in John 13, there's this, we're in what's called the Upper Room Discourse. It's the longest teaching section we know of in the scriptures of Jesus just to the 12. And this is just hours before Jesus is going to go to the cross. And so 13 through 17, those 5 chapters are instructive. It's kind of Jesus' last words until he gives them a few more words after his resurrection. But some of the language here is almost exactly repeated over in 1 John. So if you go to 13, starting in 33, this is the words of Jesus to the 12. Little children. Sound familiar? Yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I'm going you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I've loved you, you also are to love one another. Okay, go back to 1 John. I just want you to see, sometimes we need to make these connections in our Bible, that Jesus literally taught this to the 12, and I think it's one of those things that John never got over. That John talks a lot about love in his 3 letters that we're looking at here, and it hugely impacted him. And then it wouldn't be hours later he would see the extent of Jesus' love as he went to the cross, and then was buried, and then rose again. But he's literally saying, here's the command, to love one another. And one of the things that's interesting to me about 1 John, I also want you to look over, just glance your eyes over to chapter 4. And start at verse 7, because there's 2 aspects of love that I think will really be instructive for us, but part of it lies in 4. So we'll see this again. Here John says, Beloved, let us love one another. Same command, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God, knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. Here's my very practical way of thinking about if there was a simple definition in my mind of two aspects of Christian love that we need to be growing in, and I think can be very practical in how we live it out today, is this. Love is getting close and is sacrificing. Because what 1 John 4 lays out is the incarnation. Jesus came, he showed up. Jesus has always existed, he's eternal, but he took on flesh and dwelt among us and showed us what love looked like all the way to the cross. He got close. He got close in human form, so we'd actually have a human example of what this looks like, to sacrifice everything. So he got close and he sacrificed. If you combine 1 John 3 and 1 John 4, to me, those are the two very practical ways that I can hold on to of what love should look like towards my wife, towards my kids, towards my coworkers, towards my neighbors, towards anybody that's in my orbit. Now, do I do that really well and perfectly all the time? Absolutely not. But I'm striving for that. But the idea is hard to love from a distance. I think you have to get close. And then a love that is confounding to the world is a love that sacrifices. Not just a token of giving what you can afford to give, and I mean that in every way, but giving possibly to the point of where it hurts, whether that's time, resources, whatever it may look like, words of encouragement. But it's getting close and sacrificing. I think this is literally the markers of the love that John's saying is the social test of what it really means to be a Christ follower. So growing in righteousness, sacrificial love, and that requires that we get close to people to actually love them well. Connecting with that? Does that make sense too? Well, let's stop there. I'll wrap up with just a couple more thoughts. He gives us example of Cain and Abel. So he's illustrating something. And we know this story goes all the way back to Genesis. And I think essentially he's saying, look, here's the difference. Cain took life. Jesus gave his life. Profound difference. Cain, he literally says, was a murderer because he was offended that Abel's sacrifice was better than his. And so he murdered his brother. He took life. Jesus, and total distinction to that is, he voluntarily gave his life on our behalf. Both died, Abel and Jesus, but under very different circumstances. And I think sometimes we have to realize that we can take life actually in a variety of ways. I realize I can take life by simply ignoring people. I can take life when I say hurtful words. I can take life sometimes through my deeds. I don't have to actually kill somebody to take a little bit of life from them. But I can also be a life giver through my words, through my deeds, through showing up in a variety of ways, especially sacrificial love. And I think we have to remember that. Sometimes as men, I know I can go to the extremes like, well, hey, at least I'm not a murderer yet. But the other side of it is, yeah, but how do I just take life a little bit every day? And then how can I give life a little bit every day in the name of Jesus? So I think we have to also realize that I think he's calling us in the sacrificial love to be life givers to all those around us. I'll end with this. At the very end, verses 19 through 24, he kind of gives us some assurances. I think he literally says it's meant to kind of reassure our hearts. And he makes this distinction between a heart that might condemn us, and I think he's really speaking to our own internal reality, that sometimes we're condemning ourselves. We're not accepting Christ's forgiveness for us on a regular moment-by-moment basis, and we look at our actions and we know they're not morally perfect. We know we're not always loving sacrificially, and so we may get down on ourselves and condemn ourselves, which ignores the love that Christ has already bestowed upon us, but also doesn't help us because it can keep us stuck right where we are, and maybe even stuck in our sin. And so he reminds us that here's the beauty of a heart that doesn't condemn itself. Here's the beauty of a heart that continues to abide in Jesus and lives out that relationship with him. And you get this picture in verse 24 in particular of a mutual abiding, which is beautiful. Not only do we abide in him, but he abides in us. There's this mutual relationship that he has promised. As we pursue him, he is already abiding in us. We know the very Spirit of God lives within us. I still don't understand that. It doesn't physically make sense to me, but I take it on faith. That the Spirit of God indwells us if we have come to faith in Jesus. So there's this reciprocal, mutual abiding. His resources are always present to us. And then he tells us there's a couple of advantages when we live with an uncondemning heart. One, we gain God confidence. We gain God confidence to take on the world. Even though the world's going to persecute us, the world's going to hate us for our stand for Jesus. And I know I need that God confidence. My confidence will not suffice. I need a different level and form of confidence. And he says an uncondemning heart will feed God confidence. But then he also says an uncondemning heart will feed our prayer life. That as we talk to God, he hears us. And that he longs to supply us with what we need to walk with him. And so we can bring all our requests before him. And again, I often tell men in particular too that I think the Psalms are a great encouragement. God can actually handle our rants and ravings as well and our frustrations. And we can voice all that to him. It doesn't throw him off. He already knows you're frustrated. Might as well voice it. But I find in the declaration of it, when I take my frustrations and my condemned heart sometimes that I've self-condemned back to him, there's healing, there's grace, there's resources to flip that around and reorient back to him so that I can stay on that path of growing moral righteousness and I can maybe get a little bit better today at sacrificial love. And all of this is anchored in our belief in him and our abiding in him today as we focus on that certain future hope of his return. So go to your tables. We couldn't figure out the slides. Technical errors. So there were some questions, but mainly the questions were very simple. What stuck with you as you studied the passage for yourself, and then what stuck out and you want to think more about from anything I had to say from up here. So combine those two thoughts and just have some rich conversation around your table, and then I'll come back up in a little bit and close this out. Okay? So have some good discussion around your table over this passage.